been doing in Washington. That is incredible work. Um, Thank you, everyone, for having me today. I'm super excited to talk about the state of local news. Um, I thought that I would kind of give sort of a high level national picture of what's going on here. And then I'm really excited to dig in with Jerry to learn about what's going on the streets of San Mateo County and all of the great work that his publication is doing there. Um, so I thought I would start with a little bit of a sort of a how we got here moment. Some of this will not be a surprise to some of you, but I think it might be some nice context setting for our discussion today. So um, for much of the 20th century, local news was very strong. This is often referred to as the Golden Age. The primary outlets that were delivering original content in local news were, of course, newspapers. And they largely had a market monopoly because we were working within a context of information scarcity, right? Like there weren't that many places you could go to for information. And so the news organizations were it, right? You tuned into the local news on TV, you read your local newspaper, your alt weekly, your public radio station. Um, and that combined with a relatively overall high level of trust in institutions meant that these were good years financially for local news organizations. Um, I do want to say that I do put golden age in quotes here because even though newspapers were very robust, local news systems were very robust, they weren't serving everybody equally, right? They tended to serve some audiences more than others, and so I do think it's important to state that it wasn't a golden age for all information consumers, but for many. Um, and then we get to the early 2000s, where local news and journalism in general really experienced a huge disruption in its business model. Of course, the way that most local news organizations were funded was through advertising, both like the ads from businesses, but also classified advertisement. And news was really subsidized by those. And of course, those were significantly like shattered basically by the rise of the internet, right? Like classified ads, what you could go to Craigslist for that. And then, of course, Google and increasingly more of the platforms became so adept at targeting folks for online advertising that there's not kind of a market left over after all of that. So the underpinnings of the finances of what was keeping local news organizations robust basically kind of crumbled beneath, which was really resulted in kind of a general overall market failure for how you fund local news. Now, this is not universal. Jerry and I both run news organizations that are proving this to be an exception here. But generally speaking, the business model collapsed, and we started to see decreasing trust in institutions and the media. Right, like news and journalism is kind of an institution, even though our mission is to hold other institutions accountable. That brings us to the 2010s. This was a real age of information democratization. This is the true rise of social media. And now we're operating in a context of information abundance, right? There's so much information out there. Anyone can share news and information. And just the way that you engage in it, it completely changed. And this is a really beautiful thing in a lot of ways, right? We're hearing voices all over. You could see that there's a lot of impact of this sort of like on the street perspective, not just in the US, but globally. But it also coincided with bad actors who are trying to share information for nefarious gains, right? So this is the rise of misinformation, disinformation, information that is intended to confuse or sort of like has a secret agenda, and is using all of the tools available for not societal benefit. This is also combined with a really just a consolidation of existing media organizations. You start to see fewer independently owned newspaper organizations, local news publications. You start to see more consolidation. And some of the consolidation is more like a venture capitalist style, um, where large chains buy up struggling news organizations and then they kind of like strip them for parts, basically, in an effort to make a profit. So you're starting to see this accelerate, which means less local news for communities. That brings us to the early 2020s. The loss is accelerating, but there's also some really exciting resurgence happening. So this is the rise of algorithmic information, right? Like folks getting the information they want tailored to their needs, and then they just don't see other pieces of information. The consolidation across news organizations is very aggressive at this point. And there are just more and more kind of big conglomerates and fewer independent sources of news. You've seen a lot of closures of news organizations, but you're also seeing a real resurgence in independent news. So 2020 was an absolutely astonishing year for new news organizations forming, new local news organizations. And there are two reasons for that. One is the COVID pandemic really underscored for people the importance of local in your backyard news, because what was happening in your immediate community like was the most important thing, and what was happening elsewhere important too, but like you needed to know. So there were a lot of news organizations that were formed in that time. And then also the racial reckoning and the George Floyd murder, and all of the sort of upheaval and the social uprising that was happening during that time also inspired a lot of folks to form news organizations, because they were like, you know what, my community has not been well served and they deserve to be well served with local news. So I'm going to start a news organization to serve them. So a complicated time, those early 2020s. Which brings us to today, right? Everything is accelerating. The rise of AI is really upending sort of business models and the way that people find information. And so there's a lot of shifting there. We're not just in a context of information abundance, but information overload, where people are actually trying to keep out information because so much of it is coming. And so news organizations are really thinking about how to reach people in that environment. And the stakes are higher, which I'll get to in a moment, because local news plays a really powerful role in sort of like the institutions and our democratic institutions. And then independent news continues to really accelerate as folks are understanding the importance of that. More news organizations are forming. Existing independent news organizations are getting stronger. So it's still a very complicated and uneven time, but there's a lot of really cool things happening. But first, I'm going to depress you a little bit because I really feel like it's important to talk about the impact of the loss of local news. So I heard Lynn talking about some of the research into what we call news deserts, which are counties across the US that don't have any local source of news at all. So you can see in this map, those are the yellow counties. So there's just absolutely no local news there at all. The light purple are the ones where there's one maybe outlet, and then the purple counties are the ones that have multiple. And you can see here, San Mateo County is one of those. So you can look at the purple here and you can be like, that's awesome. Or you could look at the light purple and the yellow and be like, ooh, we've got some work to do, which is kind of where I land. So where we're at now is about 2.5 newspapers close each week. Again, newspapers are the primary source of original reporting on local communities. So that's a real loss. 55 million Americans just straight up don't have access to local news at all. There's a 43% increase in those mergers and acquisitions that I was talking about. Sometimes a merger and acquisition is good and it actually enables more news for local communities, but often it results in less. And then overall, oh, that can't be right. I think that might be 2005. There's been a significant decrease in newspaper employment. Again, newspapers, the primary providers of original reporting. And when there are fewer reporters on the ground, there's less local news. And so sometimes this results in what we call ghost newspapers, where it's a newspaper, it's been there, maybe, maybe it's changed ownership or whatever, but the amount of local news it's producing is almost nothing, or sometimes actually nothing. So it feels like there's something there. On paper, there's something there, but in practice, there isn't. And of course, the consequences of a lack of loss of local news on our communities are really, really dire. The body of research is really showing this connection directly. So if there is a decline in original reporting, original local news, of course that results in a less informed public. Now, I think it's interesting to draw a distinction between informed and sort of getting information, right? We're all inundated with information, but how much of it is actually informing us? And so those who get not good quality information on their local communities, it leads directly to declines in civic engagement. So fewer people vote in areas where there are no or little local news, and civic engagement goes down. And that's a pretty direct result. Government waste increases. Of course, journalism holds itself accountable to holding public institutions accountable. So when there's no one kind of keeping an eye on things, waste increases. And here's one that I think is really interesting. Polarization increases in communities where there is not a strong local news presence because folks are getting national information. And as you all know, our national information ecosystem is so polarized, so us and them. So you get information here for these people and here for these people. And so local news is a place to bring folks together and be like, except for that, we all live here, right? So like, let's have a shared reality because we have to. And in the absence of that, people just opt into that national narrative. There's research that shows that even running editorial pieces, so opinion pieces in local news organizations about national politics increases polarization. So it's a really strong effect. And I think, we're all kind of thinking about what that means today. And yet there is true growth and innovation. And you've got here Jerry on the call, right, who's going to talk about the incredible work that he's doing in his community. So this is another map of all of the digital news outlets across the US. So, in addition to strong, like print newspapers that are doing great work, there's also these additional, usually digital only news organizations. Sometimes they are, it's just online, sometimes it's via a newsletter, sometimes it's via text message. Right. So there's all sorts of different ways that these organizations are reaching folks. Um, and there's 1,300 digital news orgs in the United States by count of this source Project Oasis, which I used to be a little bit involved in. But they're doing a strong count, not just in the US, but across the world. 217 new orgs were launched just from 2020 to 2024. So I mentioned that was a big growth period as local news became more people understood the benefit of it. 1 in 7 of these orgs were started specifically to address the news desert. So this is the Project Oasis, right? You get it, news desert, oasis. Um, this is both clever and true because these are true information oases. And here's a really interesting thing. 59% of these organizations are led by women. Across the board, these independent news organizations are uh, there's a much higher likelihood that they are led by a woman or a person of color or someone who is sort of younger. So there's true innovation happening here and sort of a change from the way that it was done before, and a change of outlook that is often reflected in the way that they're serving their communities. So I work at the American Journalism Project, and we're playing a big role in this. So what we do is we provide transformative funding for nonprofit news organizations, and then we help them meet very, very ambitious growth goals to better serve their communities and to serve more folks. Um, so we do a couple of things. We provide large grants to folks to help them grow. And then we also go into areas where there isn't as strong a local news presence as there maybe could or should be. And we do a whole bunch of research and coalition building to work with folks who are stakeholders, funders, existing news organizations, other nonprofits, saying, okay, what does this area need? And then we help launch whatever everybody decides is needed. So we're really making big bets and big plays. You can see on the map here, the little lights are news organizations that we support across the country. And so, yeah, we're really proud of the work that we do. We call ourselves a venture philanthropy organization because we're really helping folks take the grants that we make and turn it into like true and lasting growth. So we currently support 54 nonprofit news organizations across the United States. We just launched 9 new newsrooms in 2024. So real boots on the ground there. Our organizations overall are increasing their revenue year over year. We really support on the business side of things. So, like, we look to these sorts of metrics to be like, but how is it going? A strong business supports strong journalism, which supports strong communities. And we believe news is a public good. So, 23% median revenue growth. And then 717 journalists in the field at the organizations we work with. And that's how one of the ways we measure success. Are there more journalists being hired based off of the work that we're doing on the business side of things? Um, Lynn touched on this a bit, and I was excited to hear about all of the progress that's happening there. But really, overall, there's a lot of progress happening in terms of local news strengthening. So the goal is, of course, impactful journalism, right? Really important, strong journalism that serves people, helps them make sense of things, helps them be engaged in their world and in their life and in their civic life. Um, and so there's some exciting things happening. One, public awareness of the local news, of the importance of local news, is growing. We There's a lot of research that shows that most people don't know that like local news needs to be supported and is having needs stakeholders and is not just a thing that happens magically. So that public awareness is a huge piece of it. We're also seeing philanthropy getting involved in local news in the way that they would any other important mission-based cause. Because again, no matter what you're doing, having strong information around it is incredibly important. So there's been a huge rise in nonprofit news organizations and sort of like national and local philanthropic interest in news. So that's been a real burgeoning area. There has been a lot of movement on the public policy front in terms of supporting local news. So there have been a handful of public policy things happening in states across the US, Washington included. Again, Lynn, thanks for teeing that up. But understanding that if local news is a public good, then there does need to be some public policy support for it in a way that, you know, still enables local news organizations to hold public institutions accountable. And then finally, news organizations are really thinking about what it looks like to be resilient and to be sustainable, to really have a strong business function that is shoring up the journalistic function that is sort of like that mission. So you're seeing more diverse revenue streams for organizations. You're seeing interesting kind of like ownership and tax structure models that are helping folks get build the coalitions they need to build, and really relying on communities to support local news because that's the true beneficiary. So there's a lot of really exciting things happening. And There's still loss. I don't want to, put on blinders to that. But if you're only looking at what we're losing, you're not able to see what we're gaining, and what we're gaining is something truly significant. So I'll just quickly give you a couple of examples of journalism that makes a difference. These are some of the organizations that my organization works with, doing true heroes work. So there's an organization in New York called The City. You may have seen this in the news a couple of months ago. The mayor of New York straight up tried to bribe a reporter by putting money in a bag of chips and handing it to her. And that was a news organization that we work with, and of course, reporting on that um, pl undoubtedly played a role in the sort of the way that administration petered out. Um, we work with an organization in Chicago called Block Club. And as you know, Chicago was the site of a lot of immigration raids and a lot of protest action. And the way that protesters and news reporters were being treated, they were being pepper sprayed, tear gassed, just trying to do their jobs. And so this organization filed a legal suit to say that they can't do that. And that was actually kind of a brave moment because that then makes them a target, right? And they won that. So they're standing up for kind of like the rights of local news practitioners to do their job for their communities. A really wonderful organization in Minneapolis and the Twin Cities, the Sahan Journal. Their whole mission is to cover the immigrant community in St. Paul and Minneapolis. And so when the federal immigration action got extremely intense there, that's their whole job. They were already there. They already have built trust with this community. They're already doing incredible work. So when the spotlight fades from Minneapolis, they're still going to be there just doing that incredible boots on the ground work to serve this population that has not been very well served. Um, just to think again about what it looks like when you've got really strong local news, when you're in the national spotlights, we work with an organization called El Paso Matters. Of course, we all heard that the El Paso airport was closed down and then open, and there's sort of a battle between, the FAA and sort of border entities that resulted in that closure. And that was a national story, right? But like, what does it mean for El Pasoans? I don't know. People who live and work and are in El Paso, they don't have an airport for a while, right? So this organization is already on the ground talking about what does that mean for you? And then, of course, this organization, also in Chicago, called City Bureau, won the Pulitzer Prize in 2024. And I think it's really a very cool thing to note that the last three Pulitzer Prizes for local news have been awarded to these independent startup organizations, which really shows, I think, the high caliber of journalism that independent organizations are doing, and that they're doing in Washington. That is incredible work. Um, Thank you, everyone, for having me today. I'm super excited to talk about the state of local news. Um, I thought that I would kind of give sort of a high level national picture of what's going